I spent 4 months tracking down a rare 1952 Patek Philippe nautical chronometer for my girlfriend Brianna's 2-year anniversary, only to watch her throw it in the trash. People think they understand ungrateful, but they've never seen someone literally discard a $5,000 gift because it didn't photograph well for Instagram. I'm a marine salvage engineer, 29 years old, and I've spent my career understanding the value of things that most people overlook. When you spend your days recovering lost treasures from shipwrecks, you develop an appreciation for craftsmanship and history that goes beyond surface appeal. Brianna used to share that appreciation. We met at a maritime antique show in Charleston where she was photographing vintage compass collections for her lifestyle blog. She seemed genuinely fascinated by the stories behind each piece, asking thoughtful questions about provenance and maritime history. Back then, she understood that real value isn't always about brand recognition or price tags. That woman felt like a distant memory as I watched her examine the chronometer box with barely concealed disgust. We were sitting at Harbor House, the exclusive waterfront restaurant where we'd had our first date. I'd made reservations weeks in advance, specifically requesting the corner table overlooking Charleston Harbor where antique sailing vessels often moored. The setting felt perfect for presenting a gift that represented both our shared history and my feelings for her. The chronometer itself was extraordinary. Authenticated by 3 different experts, it had belonged to a World War II naval officer who'd used it during the D-Day invasion. The brass case showed the patina of age and use, while the movement still kept perfect time after 7 decades. Captain Rodriguez at Maritime Antiquities had spent months locating it through his network of collectors and dealers. The price was steep, but for something with that level of historical significance and emotional meaning, it felt appropriate. I'd rehearsed my presentation, planning to explain the watch's connection to naval history and how it reminded me of our early conversations about maritime heritage. Instead, Brianna opened the box, glanced at the timepiece for maybe 3 seconds, and immediately closed it with visible disappointment. She asked where I'd gotten it, and when I mentioned the antique dealer, her expression shifted to something approaching disgust. She told me she didn't do discount trash and asked why I couldn't have gotten something from Tiffany or Van Cleef, something that would actually look good in photos. Her voice carried the particular tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow. The transformation was jarring. This was the same woman who used to spend weekends exploring maritime museums and antique shops, who'd once told me that mass-produced luxury items lacked soul. Now she was dismissing a genuine piece of history because it didn't carry the right brand name. I tried explaining the chronometer's significance, its rarity, its connection to actual historical events. She interrupted me to say that her followers wouldn't understand why I'd given her something that looked like it belonged in a pawn shop. Then she picked up the box and literally threw it into the trash bin beside our table. The sound of the wooden case hitting the metal bottom echoed across the restaurant's quiet dining room. Other patrons turned to stare as she pushed back from the table and stood up. She announced that she was going to live stream about this disaster of an anniversary celebration, pulling out her phone and immediately switching into her performative online persona. Her voice became animated and indignant as she described being disappointed by someone who clearly didn't understand her worth or how to treat a woman properly. She complained about men who think they can get away with cheap gifts just because something is old, completely missing the irony that the chronometer cost more than most people's monthly salary. The live stream continued as she walked out of the restaurant, leaving me sitting alone at a table set for 2 with an untouched dinner and a $5,000 watch sitting in a garbage bin. The humiliation was secondary to the realization that I'd been completely wrong about who she'd become. After she disappeared into the Charleston evening, I retrieved the chronometer from the trash. The wooden box had a small dent from the impact, but the watch inside was undamaged. I sat there holding this piece of history, thinking about the naval officer who'd relied on it during one of the most important military operations in human history, and how Brianna had dismissed it without a second thought. The waiter approached cautiously, probably unsure whether to offer condolences or pretend nothing had happened. I paid the bill, left a substantial tip because none of this was his fault, and drove home through Charleston's historic district thinking about how completely I'd misjudged someone I thought I loved. That night, I placed the chronometer on my coffee table and really examined it for the first time since bringing it home. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, every component precisely engineered to function in the harsh conditions of naval warfare. The inscription on the back read, "To Lieutenant Commander Harrison, may this guide you safely home." Lieutenant Commander Harrison had carried this exact timepiece during the D-Day invasion, using it to coordinate navigation during one of history's most critical military operations. This wasn't just a watch, it was a tangible connection to genuine heroism and sacrifice, representing everything I valued about maritime history and everything Brianna had once claimed to appreciate about authentic, meaningful objects. The contrast between the watch's significance and Brianna's dismissal crystallized something I'd been trying to ignore for months. She'd fundamentally changed from someone who appreciated genuine value into someone who measured worth solely through social media metrics and brand recognition. What started as authentic shared interest in maritime history had devolved into performative lifestyle curation, where meaningful objects mattered less than their potential for generating online engagement. I realized I'd been dating a carefully constructed online persona rather than the real person underneath, and that person had apparently decided that someone who valued historical significance over Instagram aesthetics wasn't worth keeping around. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything between us. I carefully packaged the chronometer back in its original presentation box and drove to Maritime Antiquities to return it to Captain Rodriguez. The old man examined the slight dent in the wooden case with practiced eyes, running his weathered fingers over the damage like he was reading a story. He didn't ask questions about what had happened, but I could see the understanding in his expression when I explained I needed to return the piece. After authentication and processing fees, he handed me a check for $4,200, significantly less than I'd originally paid but fair considering the circumstances. I accepted the refund without complaint, knowing the chronometer would find its way to someone who truly appreciated its historical significance. Captain Rodriguez provided me with detailed documentation of the transaction, including the original sales receipt, authentication certificates, and provenance papers that clearly showed the watch's estimated value and historical importance. The paperwork told the complete story of Lieutenant Commander Harrison's timepiece, from its wartime service to its journey through various collectors before reaching his shop. I drove straight to Brianna's apartment with the documentation, using my key to enter while she was at work. Her kitchen island, a massive granite surface that dominated her open-concept living space, had always served as her staging area for lifestyle photography. She'd spend hours arranging objects for the perfect flat lay shots, adjusting lighting and angles to create content that suggested effortless luxury. I placed the sales receipt and authentication documents in the center of that granite surface, spreading them out so she couldn't miss the details when she walked in. The paperwork clearly showed the chronometer's provenance as a genuine World War II naval officer's timepiece, authenticated by multiple maritime experts and valued at substantially more than her monthly rent. I left my apartment keys beside the documents, making it clear that I wouldn't be returning. The symbolism felt appropriate, placing evidence of her massive mistake in the exact spot where she crafted her carefully curated online image. Within 3 hours of leaving those documents, my phone started ringing. Brianna's first call came while I was back at work, reviewing structural assessments for a shipwreck recovery project off the coast of Savannah. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to her increasingly frantic message about finding the papers and not understanding what they meant. Her voice carried a shrill quality I'd never heard before, the sound of someone realizing they'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. The second call came an hour later, this time with a completely different tone. She'd clearly had time to research the chronometer's actual value and understand exactly what she'd thrown away. Her voice cracked as she demanded to know why I hadn't told her how much the watch was worth, as if the price tag should have been the determining factor in whether she appreciated the gift. She seemed genuinely bewildered that I'd expected her to value something based on its historical significance rather than its monetary worth. The third call devolved into barely controlled panic. She'd apparently spent the afternoon calling various luxury watch dealers and maritime antique shops, trying to understand how she could have so completely misjudged the chronometer's value. Her voice was thick with tears as she explained that she'd told her friends and followers about rejecting a cheap gift, not realizing she was actually describing the dismissal of a museum-quality artifact. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was more upset about looking foolish online than about hurting someone she'd claimed to love. By evening, she was demanding that I immediately drive back to Captain Rodriguez's shop and repurchase the chronometer, as if the entire situation could be easily reversed through financial transaction. She seemed genuinely confused when I explained that her actions had demonstrated her true priorities with perfect clarity, and that no amount of money could undo the revelation of her character. Her final message that night contained a mixture of desperation and indignation, claiming that I was being unreasonable and that everyone makes mistakes when they're surprised. She insisted that if I really loved her, I'd fix the situation and give her another chance to properly appreciate the gift. The complete lack of genuine accountability in her words confirmed everything I'd realized the night before. She wasn't sorry for hurting me or for dismissing something meaningful. She was sorry for making herself look bad and losing access to something valuable. What happened next turned into the most sophisticated manipulation campaign I'd ever witnessed, orchestrated with the precision of a military operation and the creativity of a social media influencer who'd lost her mind. Brianna mobilized every resource at her disposal to pressure me into reconciliation, turning our breakup into a full-scale psychological warfare operation that would have been impressive if it wasn't so completely unhinged. The campaign began with her influencer network, a carefully cultivated group of lifestyle bloggers and social media personalities who specialized in relationship advice and luxury lifestyle content. Within days of our breakup, I started receiving messages from accounts I'd never heard of, all sharing remarkably similar stories about how rare and meaningful gifts sometimes get misunderstood in the moment, and how true love requires forgiveness and second chances. These weren't random strangers offering unsolicited advice. They were coordinated posts designed to make me feel like the villain for not accepting Brianna's apology and taking her back immediately. The messages came with professional quality graphics featuring quotes about forgiveness and relationship wisdom, complete with branded watermarks that revealed their true source. Her family became the next wave of pressure, starting with her younger sister Emma, who called to tell me how devastated Brianna was and how she'd been crying for days about losing the most important relationship of her life. Emma painted a picture of someone who'd learned a valuable lesson about appreciating meaningful gestures, claiming that Brianna spent every evening researching maritime antiques and naval history to better understand what she'd rejected. The story was touching until I realized that Emma was reading from what sounded like a prepared script, complete with specific talking points about growth and redemption that matched the themes from the influencer campaign. Her parents followed with their own intervention attempts, inviting me to family dinner under the pretense of wanting to maintain our relationship regardless of what happened between Brianna and me. The dinner was obviously a setup, with Brianna appearing halfway through the evening looking appropriately remorseful and armed with a presentation about maritime chronometers that she'd clearly memorized from Wikipedia articles. The performance was polished but hollow, like watching someone deliver a book report about a subject they'd crammed for the night before rather than genuinely understood. The most disturbing escalation came when she hired a private investigator to track my daily routines and coordinate what she called accidental encounters at places I regularly visited. My favorite coffee shop suddenly became a frequent stop for Brianna, who would arrive precisely 5 minutes after I did and position herself strategically within my line of sight. She'd bring maritime history books and spread them across her table like props in a stage production, occasionally sighing loudly while taking notes and glancing in my direction with practiced melancholy. The gym I'd been attending for 3 years became another staging ground for these manufactured coincidences, with Brianna appearing in expensive workout attire she'd clearly never worn before, struggling with equipment she obviously didn't understand while positioning herself near my usual routine stations. The private investigator's work became obvious when these encounters started happening with mathematical precision, timed perfectly to intersect with my schedule in ways that would have been impossible through genuine coincidence. Her cousin Taylor, who I'd always considered one of the more reasonable members of Brianna's family, called my phone number claiming there was a family emergency and that Brianna needed to speak with me immediately about something related to her grandfather's health. The urgency in Taylor's voice convinced me to take the call, only to discover that the emergency was fabricated and Taylor was actually helping Brianna bypass the fact that I'd blocked her primary phone number. When I confronted Taylor about participating in this deception, she defended it as helping two people who obviously belong together work through a simple misunderstanding, completely missing the point that coordinated lying wasn't the foundation of healthy relationships. The social media component of her campaign reached truly impressive levels of manipulation and production value that would have made professional marketing teams jealous. She hired actual photographers to document her supposed emotional breakdown, creating carefully curated content that painted our breakup as a tragic misunderstanding between two people who clearly belonged together. The photos showed her visiting maritime museums and antique shops, always photographed in moments of contemplative sadness while examining vintage nautical instruments with newfound appreciation. Her Instagram stories became a daily documentary of someone learning to value historical significance and meaningful craftsmanship, complete with captions about growth and understanding that felt like they'd been written by a relationship counselor with a literature degree. She posted screenshots of maritime history articles she was supposedly reading, shared quotes about the importance of preserving naval heritage, and even visited the same Charleston Harbor locations where we'd spent time together early in our relationship. The content was professionally shot and expertly edited, creating a narrative arc of redemption and personal growth that would have been convincing if I hadn't known it was entirely performative. The most audacious part of her social media campaign was a series of posts about the importance of supporting local antique dealers and preserving maritime history, featuring visits to Captain Rodriguez's shop and other nautical antiquities stores around Charleston. She presented herself as someone who discovered a passionate interest in naval artifacts and historical preservation, posting detailed explanations of chronometer mechanics and navigation history that she'd clearly researched specifically for this purpose. The irony of watching her promote the very expertise and appreciation she'd dismissed so completely just weeks earlier was almost surreal. 2 months after our breakup, Brianna escalated her campaign beyond manipulation into outright criminal behavior that crossed every boundary of reasonable human conduct. I discovered she'd been using my stored payment information to make unauthorized purchases, having memorized my credit card details during the many months when we'd shared online shopping sessions and vacation bookings. The first fraudulent charge appeared on my statement as a $3,200 purchase from Cartier, specifically for a diving watch that she'd apparently decided would demonstrate her newfound appreciation for maritime equipment and nautical precision. The brazenness of the theft was staggering, not just because of the amount but because of how she tried to justify it as relationship maintenance rather than recognizing it as the felony it actually was. When I confronted her about the unauthorized charge, her initial response was complete denial, claiming she had no idea how my card information could have been used and suggesting that maybe my account had been compromised by identity thieves. She maintained this fiction for exactly as long as it took me to mention that credit card companies maintain detailed transaction records and that Cartier keeps comprehensive purchase documentation, including delivery addresses and customer verification information. Faced with easily verifiable evidence, she switched tactics and attempted to reframe the theft as a romantic gesture gone wrong, insisting that she'd been planning to surprise me with a gift that showed her genuine understanding of quality timepieces and maritime craftsmanship. The story was obviously fabricated on the spot, falling apart under the most basic scrutiny since we'd been broken up for 2 months and had no contact beyond her relentless stalking campaign. When the romantic gift explanation failed, she shifted to what I can only describe as delusional entitlement, claiming that the purchase was actually a relationship investment since she fully intended for us to reunite anyway, making the watch technically mutual property in her twisted logic. She explained this theory with the confidence of someone who genuinely believed that her intentions and expectations created legal reality, completely ignoring the fact that unauthorized use of someone else's financial information constitutes credit card fraud regardless of the purchaser's romantic aspirations. The conversation became even more surreal when she started detailing her research into luxury diving watches and how she'd specifically chosen the Cartier piece because of its reputation for precision and maritime applications, as if demonstrating product knowledge somehow retroactively justified identity theft. Her research was obviously superficial, lifted directly from marketing materials and customer reviews, but she presented it with the enthusiasm of someone who'd discovered a profound new passion rather than someone who'd committed a federal crime. The situation reached peak absurdity when her younger brother Jake called to defend her actions and explain that I was fundamentally misunderstanding both her motivations and the severity of the situation. According to Jake, what I was characterizing as identity theft was actually creative relationship problem-solving by someone who was desperately trying to demonstrate personal growth and renewed appreciation for the things that mattered to me. He suggested that my reaction was disproportionate and that most men would be flattered to have someone care enough about them to make such a significant financial gesture, completely missing the distinction between a gift purchased with someone's own money and theft committed using stolen financial information. Jake's call revealed the extent to which Brianna had successfully manipulated her family's perception of events, presenting herself as a heartbroken woman making grand romantic gestures rather than a criminal who decided that wanting something justified stealing it. His genuine confusion about why I wasn't grateful for her efforts showed how effectively she'd rewritten the narrative within her social circle, transforming felony fraud into misunderstood romance through sheer force of personality and selective storytelling. The family's willingness to enable and justify her behavior explained a lot about how someone develops the kind of entitlement that leads to throwing expensive gifts in garbage bins and then stealing money to buy replacements. When I threatened to involve law enforcement and file formal charges for credit card fraud, Brianna's response revealed the calculating nature that had been hidden beneath her supposed emotional breakdown. Within hours of my ultimatum, the Cartier watch appeared on my doorstep with overnight shipping, still in its original packaging and accompanied by what appeared to be a professionally written apology letter acknowledging that she'd made an error in judgment while trying to demonstrate her commitment to our relationship. The speed and efficiency of the return suggested that she'd been prepared for this possibility and had contingency plans ready for implementation. Simultaneously, her social media presence shifted dramatically from heartbroken romantic to empowered woman discussing toxic masculinity and financial abuse in relationships, posting carefully crafted content about men who use money as a tool of control and manipulation. The posts never explicitly mentioned our situation, but anyone following her previous content about maritime history and second chances would have easily connected the dots and understood that I was being painted as the villain in her revised narrative. She managed to simultaneously return stolen property to avoid criminal charges while positioning herself as the victim of financial abuse, a level of strategic manipulation that was both impressive and deeply disturbing. 3 months later, Brianna orchestrated what can only be described as the most expensive and elaborate manipulation scheme I'd ever encountered, involving private investigators, antique dealer networks, and a fabricated medical emergency that would have made professional con artists jealous. Through her network of contacts and what must have been substantial financial investment, she managed to track down the exact chronometer I'd returned to Captain Rodriguez and discovered it had been sold to a private collector in Savannah who specialized in World War II naval artifacts. The complexity of this operation suggested she'd hired professionals to locate the timepiece, probably the same private investigators she'd used to coordinate those manufactured encounters at my coffee shop and gym. What happened next revealed both her resourcefulness and her complete detachment from reality regarding appropriate relationship behavior. She contacted the Savannah collector and orchestrated an elaborate buyback operation that cost her $8,500, nearly double what I'd originally paid for the chronometer and significantly more than she'd received from returning the stolen Cartier watch. The funding for this purchase came from her wealthy parents, extracted through a completely fabricated story about needing emergency surgery for a serious medical condition that required immediate financial assistance. Her ability to lie convincingly to her own family about fictional medical emergencies demonstrated a level of manipulation that went far beyond anything I'd previously witnessed. The collector, apparently charmed by Brianna's story about reuniting with a lost family heirloom, agreed to sell the chronometer back to her at a premium price that reflected both its rarity and the inconvenience of parting with a recently acquired piece. Brianna presented herself as someone whose grandfather had owned an identical timepiece during his naval service, creating an emotional narrative that justified the collector's willingness to reverse a transaction he'd completed just months earlier. The sophistication of her deception extended to researching actual naval units and creating plausible family history that would satisfy someone knowledgeable about maritime antiques and military service records. When the chronometer arrived at my apartment, It came with what appeared to be a professionally produced video message that represented the pinnacle of manipulative performance art. The video showed Brianna in what looked like a carefully designed set meant to suggest humble introspection, wearing simple clothing and minimal makeup to convey authenticity and spiritual transformation. She spoke directly to the camera about her journey of self-discovery and how losing me had forced her to confront her shallow priorities and materialistic worldview. The script was obviously written by someone with expertise in persuasive communication, touching on themes of personal growth, spiritual awakening, and renewed appreciation for historical significance and authentic craftsmanship. Her performance included tearful testimonials about spending countless hours researching maritime history and visiting museums to understand the passion that had driven my gift selection, claiming that she'd developed genuine appreciation for naval artifacts and the stories they represented. She spoke knowledgeably about chronometer mechanics, navigation history, and the specific significance of World War II timepieces, demonstrating research depth that was impressive even if entirely motivated by manipulation rather than authentic interest. The video concluded with her acknowledging that she didn't deserve forgiveness but hoping that returning the exact chronometer I'd chosen would demonstrate the sincerity of her transformation and her understanding of what she'd lost when she'd thrown away both the gift and our relationship. The production quality was professional enough to suggest she'd hired actual videographers and possibly script writers to create content that would maximize emotional impact while appearing spontaneous and heartfelt. What struck me most about this elaborate scheme was its fundamental misunderstanding of both the problem and its potential solution. Brianna had correctly identified that her dismissal of the chronometer represented a deeper issue with her values and priorities, but her response was to purchase forgiveness rather than actually address the character flaws that had created the problem in the first place. She'd spent more money trying to undo her mistake than most people earn in several months, but hadn't invested any genuine effort in examining why she'd been so quick to dismiss something meaningful in favor of social media aesthetics. The entire operation represented exactly the kind of thinking that had caused our breakup in the first place, the belief that expensive gestures could substitute for authentic change and that financial investment could manufacture genuine emotional growth. I recognized this as her most sophisticated manipulation attempt yet, impressive in its scope and execution but fundamentally hollow because it was designed to create the appearance of transformation without requiring the difficult work of actual personal change. Rather than confronting her materialism and social media obsession, she doubled down on both by spending massive amounts of money and creating elaborate content designed to manipulate my emotions and override my rational assessment of her character. The fact that she'd lied to her own parents about medical emergencies to fund this scheme revealed depths of manipulation that made me question everything I'd thought I knew about her moral boundaries. I immediately drove back to Maritime Antiquities and returned the chronometer to Captain Rodriguez, explaining that it had been purchased under false pretenses and that I couldn't accept it as a legitimate gesture of reconciliation. Captain Rodriguez listened to the story with the patient expression of someone who'd seen enough human drama over decades in the antique business to remain unsurprised by almost anything. He accepted the return without question and assured me that he'd handle any complications that arose from the complex chain of transactions that had brought the timepiece back to his shop. That evening, I made what was probably the most necessary phone call of the entire ordeal, contacting Brianna's parents to expose her fabricated medical emergency and ensure they understood how their financial assistance had actually been used. The conversation was uncomfortable but essential, revealing that they'd liquidated part of a savings account to provide what they believed was life-saving medical funding for their daughter. Their shock at learning the truth about Brianna's deception was genuine and heartbreaking, particularly when they realized that their willingness to help during a supposed crisis had been exploited to fund an elaborate romantic manipulation scheme. The immediate consequence of this revelation was that Brianna's family froze her access to trust fund money and insisted she undergo psychological evaluation before any further financial support would be considered, effectively ending her ability to purchase increasingly expensive gestures designed to manufacture forgiveness rather than earn it through genuine change. With her financial resources curtailed and her family finally understanding the extent of her manipulation, Brianna's campaign took a darker turn that involved workplace harassment and fabricated legal emergencies designed to force direct contact despite my clear boundaries. The escalation began with a series of fake delivery emergencies at my marine engineering firm, where uniformed couriers would arrive claiming to have urgent packages that required my immediate signature and personal verification. These deliveries always turned out to be empty boxes or meaningless documents, but they succeeded in disrupting my work environment and creating awkward situations with colleagues who couldn't understand why I was receiving so many mysterious priority shipments. The pattern became obvious when the deliveries started arriving precisely during important client meetings or project deadlines, time to maximize professional embarrassment and force me to explain personal drama in workplace settings where it had no place. My firm's corporate security eventually had to implement special protocols for package delivery verification after the fifth fake emergency in 2 weeks, a humiliating situation that required me to brief my supervisor about personal stalking issues affecting company operations. The harassment escalated when bogus legal documents started arriving at my office, designed to look like court summons or subpoenas that required immediate attention and legal response. These documents were sophisticated forgeries that included official-looking letterheads and case numbers, created with enough authenticity to fool administrative staff who would interrupt my work with urgent messages about legal compliance deadlines. Each document required time and attention to verify its legitimacy through actual legal channels, creating exactly the kind of ongoing disruption that Brianna had obviously intended. The fake legal papers always contained subtle references to relationship disputes and property claims that made it clear they originated from her ongoing campaign rather than legitimate legal proceedings. When corporate security and building management could no longer ignore the pattern of harassment, they coordinated with local law enforcement to investigate the source of these fabricated emergencies and fraudulent legal documents. The investigation revealed that Brianna had been working with accomplices to create increasingly sophisticated fake documents and coordinate delivery timing that would maximize workplace disruption while technically avoiding direct violations of restraining order language that prohibited her from contacting me personally. The most disturbing escalation came when her best friend Madison orchestrated what she called an intervention at Copper Fox Brewing, one of Charleston's most popular restaurants and a place where I'd often meet colleagues for after-work drinks. Madison had apparently reserved the entire back section of the brewery and invited dozens of mutual friends and acquaintances to witness what was presented as a final attempt to help two people who obviously belonged together work through a simple misunderstanding that had gotten blown out of proportion. The gathering was staged like a professional mediation session, complete with prepared talking points and a structured agenda designed to pressure me into reconciling with someone who had demonstrated escalating patterns of harassment, fraud, and workplace sabotage. Madison presented Brianna as a reformed woman who had hit rock bottom and finally understood the magnitude of her mistakes, someone who deserved one final chance at redemption after completing therapy and demonstrating genuine commitment to personal growth. The entire production felt like an episode of reality television, with carefully orchestrated testimonials from friends describing how much Brianna had changed and how rare it was to find someone willing to fight so hard for a relationship. The intervention included printed materials outlining Brianna's supposed journey of self-discovery, complete with photos of her volunteering at maritime museums and participating in naval history preservation projects that she'd obviously joined specifically to create evidence of transformed priorities. When emotional manipulation and peer pressure failed to produce the reconciliation Madison had orchestrated, Brianna resorted to what can only be described as performance art designed to trigger protective instincts and override rational judgment. She hired actors to stage an elaborate suicide attempt outside my workplace, complete with emergency responders and police presence that created exactly the kind of dramatic crisis she'd calculated would force me to abandon my boundaries and rush to provide comfort and support. The production was sophisticated enough to fool first responders and building security, involving fake medical emergencies and scripted crisis scenarios that required significant planning and coordination to execute convincingly. The performance included Brianna being loaded into an ambulance while crying my name and expressing regret about pushing away the only person who'd ever really loved her, dialogue that was obviously written for maximum emotional impact rather than authentic crisis response. The entire spectacle was designed to make me feel responsible for someone's mental health crisis and override my logical assessment of the relationship with guilt-driven protective impulses that would compel immediate reconciliation regardless of the underlying problems that had caused our breakup. The elaborate deception backfired catastrophically when building security cameras revealed the staged nature of the entire operation, showing clear evidence of coordination between Brianna and the hired actors who had impersonated emergency medical personnel. The footage demonstrated that the supposed suicide attempt was actually a carefully choreographed performance designed to manipulate emergency services and create false crisis situations for personal gain, behavior that constituted multiple felonies including filing false police reports and misuse of emergency services resources. The criminal charges resulting from Brianna's fake emergency performance finally provided the legal framework necessary to establish clear boundaries through a restraining order and formal prosecution that ended her campaign of escalating harassment. The evidence from building security cameras was so comprehensive that law enforcement had no difficulty building cases for multiple felony charges, including filing false police reports, misuse of emergency services, fraud, and organized harassment that had interfered with normal business operations. The restraining order prohibited all direct and indirect contact, including communication through third parties, social media interaction, and presence within 500 feet of my residence or workplace, creating enforceable legal consequences for the behavior that had made normal life impossible for nearly 6 months. The prosecution moved forward efficiently because the documentation of Brianna's campaign was so extensive, from the credit card fraud to the workplace harassment to the staged emergency that had wasted city resources and endangered public safety by diverting real emergency responders from legitimate crises. Her legal team attempted to negotiate plea bargains based on claims of mental health issues and emotional distress, but the calculated nature of her schemes made it impossible to characterize her behavior as impulsive crisis response rather than deliberate criminal manipulation designed to override someone else's clearly stated boundaries. 6 months after the restraining order took effect, Brianna made one final attempt at contact that revealed both her complete failure to understand the situation and her continued belief that the right approach could still salvage what she imagined our relationship could become. She orchestrated a carefully planned encounter in Charleston's historic district, positioning herself along my regular walking route through the antique shops and maritime museums I'd frequented since college. The meeting appeared coincidental until I realized she was wearing the exact outfit from our first date and carrying maritime history books as obvious conversation props designed to demonstrate her supposed transformation into someone who genuinely appreciated the interests she'd once dismissed. Her appearance was carefully calculated to evoke nostalgia and positive memories, from her hairstyle to her choice of location near the maritime antique shop where we'd first met. She approached with practiced remorse and what appeared to be genuine humility, acknowledging that therapy had helped her understand how badly she'd handled our anniversary dinner and expressing authentic-sounding regret for the pain she'd caused through her subsequent campaign to win me back. Her script was obviously rehearsed but delivered with more convincing emotion than her previous performances, suggesting that either she'd improved her acting abilities or had convinced herself that her feelings were genuine rather than manipulative. She claimed that professional counseling had helped her recognize her social media obsession and materialistic priorities as symptoms of deeper insecurity and fear of abandonment, presenting herself as someone who had finally done the difficult work of examining her character flaws rather than simply trying to purchase forgiveness through expensive gestures. The conversation felt different from her previous manipulation attempts because she focused on taking responsibility for her behavior rather than trying to minimize its impact or shift blame to external circumstances. However, her presence violated the restraining order terms regardless of her intentions or apparent sincerity, creating a situation that required immediate law enforcement contact rather than personal evaluation of whether her claims of transformation might be legitimate. I contacted police from my phone while maintaining safe distance, explaining that someone under a restraining order was attempting direct contact in violation of court orders designed to prevent exactly this type of encounter. The officers who responded were already familiar with the case history and handled the situation efficiently, arresting Brianna for restraining order violation without requiring lengthy explanations about the background circumstances that had made legal protection necessary. Her shock at being arrested suggested she genuinely believed that sufficient remorse and apparent personal growth would override legal boundaries, demonstrating fundamental misunderstanding of how restraining orders function and why they exist to protect people from exactly the kind of calculated encounter she'd orchestrated. The arrest finally ended her campaign because violation of restraining orders carries serious legal consequences that even her family's resources couldn't easily minimize through plea negotiations or alternative sentencing arrangements. 6 months after her arrest, while volunteering at Charleston's Maritime Museum Restoration Project, I met Lauren, a maritime archaeologist whose genuine passion for naval history and authentic appreciation for historical preservation reminded me what real shared interests actually looked like. Lauren's enthusiasm for the museum's chronometer collection was immediately obvious and completely natural, stemming from professional expertise and personal fascination rather than calculated attempts to impress someone or demonstrate manufactured interests designed to manipulate relationship dynamics. Our conversations about maritime artifacts and historical preservation felt effortless and engaging because they emerged from mutual passion rather than performance, creating the foundation for genuine connection based on shared values and authentic compatibility. The contrast between Lauren's natural appreciation for maritime history and Brianna's calculated research designed to manipulate my emotions crystallized everything I'd learned about the difference between genuine compatibility and manufactured attraction designed to achieve specific outcomes. A year after meeting Lauren, the original chronometer that had started this entire ordeal finally found its permanent home with a museum collector who understood both its historical significance and the complex human story that had brought it through multiple ownership changes before reaching someone who truly valued its authentic meaning rather than its potential for creating desired impressions.